Hello, everyone. I'm Saloni Doshi, the founder and director of Space 118. For those who don't know, Space 118 has been an artist studio and residency space for the last 10 years, where we have supported over 400 artists from all over the world. Our vision is to nurture the interdisciplinary impetus of global art practitioners through creative workshops and residencies for experimentation in the visual arts. Standing on the values of dialogue, openness, experience, and collaboration, we have now expanded our role from being a residency space into an independent grants-making body. Today, I welcome you to our talk series on Making 2020, where we invite artists and curators to take us through their art making and exhibition making practices. At a time like this, we at Space 118 feel that it is more crucial to bring audiences to behind the scene perspectives into an exhibition that is made on the scale and as grand as the ones we're featuring. Whether it is the years of rigor that finally brings an idea to fruition, from process to materiality, or the many hands of institutions and donors who lend invaluable support along the way. As an arts patron myself, I have often believed that a landmark victory after putting up a great show is getting a great audience. By expanding the reach of these exhibitions even further, especially in our current socially distant times, is exactly the kind of platform we're so pleased to be giving our speakers and the many partner institutions they represent. Joining us today is a polymath artist and a very, very dear friend whose choice of material is as diverse as her subject matter, Rina Banerjee. Born in 1963 to Indian immigrant parents, Rina grew up briefly in London and Manchester and later chiefly in New York, where she now lives and works. She received her Bachelor of Science degree from the Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio, and went to pursue a career as a Polymer Research Chemist before making a switch to formal study of painting and art historical practice at the Penn State University. Encouraged in the 1990s by David Driskell, Rina changed professions entirely by enrolling at the Yale School of Arts MFA program in Painting and Printmaking. With the scholarship at the Yale's Feminist Thought program, Rina began teaching there while earning her MFA degree. She still continues to be counted today as the core critic at her alma mater. Her work has been featured in over 13 biennales and is included in several private and public collections all over the world. Foundation Louis Vuitton, Whitney Museum of American Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Center Pompidou, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, San Jose Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, and our very own Kiran Nadar Museum of Art are some of the museums that have collected her work. I shall now let Falguni Guliani, who is our Space 118 Contemporaries art writer in residence and the moderator for today, to take it from here. Welcome, Rina. So happy to have you here.
Thank you, Saloni, for that introductory round. And a very warm welcome to Rina, whose aptly titled retrospective we are going to be having a chance for her to take us through today. It's called Make Me a Summary of Your World, and it closed at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts last March. And as I now understand it, is going to be touring the Fowler and the Frisks museums. And without further ado, I'll let Rina begin her presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Saloni. Thank you, Space 118. I'm so excited to share this work. It's a special privilege to talk to Falguni and to be able to share with you the retrospective. The retrospective came to fruition in 2018 with the opening at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So what you see before you is the building, the interior of the building, which is an older museum. It is one of the first museums and the first art school. So it's both a museum and an art school. And because of its unique position as an art school and educational system in place, as well as a museum, the curator, Jody Throckmorton, wanted to put together the permanent collection, which is a very all-American collection with my work, which in essence provokes what we understand is American today. So identity is very much part of the retrospective title, and it's about this idea of transformation. So we start today with this one sculpture, Little Red Riding Hood, which has a much more formidable title, longer, that you can gather from the website at PAFA. And it has a title that references the mythology around Little Red Riding Hood. I wanted to introduce the work with the idea that this museum is also part of a school, which is the educational system. And it's the first one in the United States. So it brings to us a huge collection, which is a permanent collection of paintings and sculpture. And so what we have in the retrospective is 60 works of my own that is integrated with works that are in the museum. So a side-by-side reference that the curator, Jody Throckmorton, has selected to be part of the exhibition is also curated. And so this selection allows us to talk about identity, and particularly how identity has changed. So I'm very pleased to share with you this particular work, Little Red Riding Hood. You see the red cape, the mink lining around the face. And it really is about the mythology of immigrant identity, going from your homeland, your home, to through this journey, which is your life, and to your ancestry, which may be your grandmother, but the journey itself is the story. And so it's also in reflection of immigrant identity and diaspora identity. So these two things take us to consider, what does it mean to be alive? What is this journey? In this particular work, you have a cot, a bed, and it's in some sense a deathbed, but it also really requires you to think about what life is in that journey. And so in this, we have a disintegrating body with a skull that is upholstered. There is this tail of glass vials, which reference curing, that all that you need in terms of nutrition and medicine is on this globe, on this earth. And so Breathless Confinement, which is the title of this work, brings us back to this point, which is this idea that the earth is so valuable for us, it determines our life itself, and then brings us to this journey. What do we do with ourselves on earth? And one of the things that I think that all human beings have done is to create an exchange of communication that has to do with commerce. One of the defining characters of contemporary culture today in commerce is empire, is the colonial period. It begins with this idea that you go to a foreign place and discover all that's there for consumption. In this drawing, I took the dodo bird as an example of that. The bird kind of reflects for me immigrant identity. I use feathers in my work to talk about mobility, but also the remains, what is left behind after the journey of life is done. So in my work, you'll see seashells, for example, a reference to landscape, but the landscape has been upturned. It's no longer in the ground, but falls from the sky, like fruit or vegetable. It determines our mobility as a chaotic experience that allows us to relearn who we are. And so both diaspora and immigrant identity is secured by this complex identity of travel, of commerce itself, and the movement of bodies in reflection. So this particular piece was done with the idea that I would take those things that are most portable, like textiles, for example, and use them in the sculpture. And a lot of these sculptures appear like flower that come off the ceiling or the wall or the floor. and they sprout, they explode and blossom, you might say. And the wealth of materials in them really invite us to think about all that is in the world, as in the title of the retrospectory, which is the summary of the world. And so this plentifulness allows us to desire to be elsewhere, to leave our home and go somewhere else. I often think of the green bodies that you see in this drawing and many of the drawings to consider our identity as aliens. In the United States, when we first came, my family, we had green cards, and a lot of these green cards later became pink cards, and the pink cards were called alien registration cards. So immediately this idea or invitation to think of how aliens are magnified in the mythology that was in the US in sci-fi narratives was really important. And you can see these bodies are many-limbed, they're disfigured, they're in transformation to become something else. Here you can see another green body. She's flying through the air atop an umbrella, and droplets which look like beets that have unplugged themselves from the earth fall from the sky. So I'm thinking of all these things that have been uprooted from the earth. And she herself, her body in the fringe of green around her leg and her buttress, become these things that are beginning to sprout roots. And so I'm using also collage to think about all this textile history that created exchange, the silk route, the spice route, and all that was there in the colonial period to create not only connections between different places, but to create division, a fabrication of East and West that would divide and conquer the world. So here you have this idea of the figure in both the sculpture as well as the drawings and paintings. This is an earlier work where I begin to use dry pigments and objects that are adhered to the surface. Fabric is used to stretch over the canvas frame. Hair is used as pigment by shuffling it into smaller and smaller pieces until they become like powder. In some sense, I'm talking about death itself, because what remains of the body that is preserved easily by the earth are things like feather, hair, seashells. And so all these things really take on this kind of baggage of our lineage, what survives us. And so everything that dies become liquid, recycled into the earth. Here's a drawing where you have multiple figures, but they begin to talk to each other in this larger universe. And you can see the globe magnified on the top as a place that has become smaller as people have grown bigger and more visible. So the visibility of people has this kind of context of relationships that are created out of commerce. You have the architectural drawings, which recur in my work. You saw it in the drawing before. Again, two figures that talk about what is going to be erupting out of death, another personage. And that is really referencing ancestry. And it's important for me to realize that all those who left us are still present in our history. I have a lot of times done smaller drawings that really create a visibility of the smaller items like insect. Here from her mouth is a string of redness that could be talking about bloodline, for example, and the arrangement of these flies in this kind of circular pattern recurs in my work. Both line in her dress, which is orange, but also the lines that create movement, that make passage possible. So I'm using those metaphors and those symbols of line to create not only the movement, but another item of metaphor, entanglement. The bodies here are attached they're also entangled. And so I'm really talking about continents that create this pleasure of exchange, but are looking in different directions. And so they don't see each other in essence. And yet they're part of one whole thing, which is the earth. So a lot of references to this relationship that is used to create metaphors in the physical work as well as in the two-dimensional work. This work is a particular interest to me to share today because I want you to think about manufactured objects like light bulbs. They are plentiful in this work, but this work also has natural items like sea foam and cowrie shells and horn, and also beads. Beads were used for trading as currency. There is goat hair, and there's threads, and there's embroidered saris in this work as well. Copper meshing, I'm referencing mining the earth. So all of these come to fruition in these wall-mounted sculpture that seem to grow and sprout. And so there is this reference to nature that is continuous throughout my work. Here you have this kind of spray of gourds that you see, and they have little eyes on the gourds to reference how alive they really are. There's the reference to the banana leaf and seagrass and droplets, which is the glass that you see underneath. And brass wire is also used, and loofah to create this kind of arrangement. I wanted to show you again the green bodies. You will notice that really kind of flower in the number of fingers you will see are never the 5, but can be less or more. There is also the use of money, and the green money, which is our dollar, our note here in the US, is also talking about greenness as a tenderness, just like pinkness. And so these colors are often used in my work to create a sense of pleasure in growth, growth in our community, and also growth in ourselves individually, our maturity. So you'll find that these figures are often, you know, in some sense spectral. They start to dissipate, disappear, become ghost-like. And so they allow the background to come forward, and you see the architectural drawings of hospitals with ventilation systems begin to appear in the drawings, and they also appear in the sculptures. You see the nails sprout longer into fluid-like lines, as does all these vein work, again talking about bloodline. So again, returning to the idea of nature, in 2017, I was invited to the 57th Venice Biennial in the Arsenal, which historically was a place to create a storage for weaponry. And today, the US remains a major maker of weapons. And it was very important to bring to the Arsenal my hope of something different in our history. I made 2 flowers. They are called excessive flower and bud. The bluer, smaller, closed flower being bud. It's darkened because it is the flower that is not yet born. So I'm really thinking about the relationship of heritage, but also our relationship to the younger generation, which I think is very pivotal in the way we think of the future. That human beings understand the future as a place where they live on, although they physically die. And so excessive flower is this desire for immortality in the hands of the youth. Here again, you've arrived to the interior and central part of the PAFA building, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And this kind of displays how ornate the building is. You can see some of the remains of the original building, which are those columns that are decorated with gold leaf, and as well as the largeness of the room and the scaling of the work itself in comparison. To the right and left are the smaller wall-mounted sculpture. On the right, Friendly Fire, and on the left, a piece about Adam and Eve and madness. And so here in the middle, you found a sculpture that I remade in 2018. And it references another earlier piece that I made at the Whitney Biennial in 2000, Infectious Migrations. And so in recreating it, I renamed it as well as Breathless Confinement. And it is this idea of confinement that occurred because of our boundaries, our borders. These borders are not only physical borders that we can't travel past, but they're the confinement conceptually of our mind. You have two heads. You have an older head on the right with white hair, and you have the younger head that has less detail. And you can see in the older head the awareness of the suffocation that I associate with our inability to be mobile, to be in charge of our two legs. And so this particular sculpture is referencing deity making that I really enjoyed throughout my life, to understand how we identify with the figure. The figure in some sense is a reflection of us, but also a reflection of all human beings that connect all of us to a single figure. In fact, it is our intimacy with that one figure, whether it be a deity or a sculpture of a figure, to realize that we are all human. So the functionality of the figure becomes very important. Here you have Friendly Fire. You can see there is a ceramic doll that is pointed towards the middle center. And then there's this idea of all these things that droop out, that fall out, untangle. There is an actual snake that routes itself on these branches. And so there's a sense of both animal and human and nature all in the same piece. Friendly Fire, as the term references, talks about killing someone who is your own. And this kind of provocative kind of situation, it has a sense of grief and loss over the accidental death of someone who is of your own. And I thought it was really relevant to the way we understand and grieve for others who we don't know that is our own in the world. And especially during this time where we grieve for whole countries that have lost people to the coronavirus. And I thought it really relevant to think about this in terms of the flower, because even the corona is itself our family, part of nature, and belongs with us as well. So there's a kind of tension and anxiety that is created out of how to balance this throughout the work, nature and ourselves. Here is a figurative work. It has these bottles, these amber bottles that I really pleasure in, because they talk about all things that are liquid, that are hard to contain, that we put inside a bottle and allow us to have a certain level of portability, like our own bodies, which is 99% water. And perhaps this kind of idea of vessel is an important one to configure into the work, especially the sculptural works. There's also this event in my work, especially the sculpture of souvenirs and souvenirs from other places. So I'm also referencing the scent of a place, perfume, how we capture, imprison the smell of a rose in a bottle, and how this is kind of a thing that we do automatically, that we go to a place and we want to bring it back home. Souvenirs made me want to think about all the rivers. So you see this egg here, this oyster kind of opening, the clam-like opening, and then these feathers that come out like this, like an oyster or a clam, but also the ostrich egg, which has these red lines that you witness in the drawings, and they reference the different largest rivers in the world. And on the bottom, you'll notice these extra large light bulbs. And you saw light bulbs earlier, but these extra large ones have painted on it these red countries. And these are countries that I've traveled to or haven't traveled to. So there's these categories of been there, done that, and came back to consider it a place that could be my home. And so I'm challenging the ideas of souvenirs as not being not just nostalgic, but a very important experience of our identity, because going to a new place really does transform the way we think of our own home. So the monkey is displayed to think about origin, where we came from. And that brings us to this piece, the Pink Taj Mahal. For me, the Taj Mahal, because of its heritage status, references India, where I came from. And ironically, no matter where I go, even though many of you might think of me as American, people always ask me where in India I'm from. Am I South Asian? And even in the larger community, in the brown community, are you from South America? Are you from the Philippines? So this kind of diaspora is created not only the way we think of it in terms of the African and Indian diaspora, but also the diaspora of likes. Certainly, I'm always considered female, but I'm also considered brown, and I'm also considered Asian. And so there are really many houses in which we are boxed in. The Taj Mahal can really think about this. In its portability, in the skin of this piece, it is temporary housing. It floats from the ground, never touching the floor. The globe in the center, on the bottom, you'll see, does sit on this pie-crusted colonial piece of furniture, Bombay Blackwood as it's called. The throne above it talks about being in command of your house, to be the king of your castles as we speak of it in the US. So I'm really thinking about all these things that create paradise, and a closure that has all things in the world, but in your home. So paradise for me is this place that really cannot take place, because our desire to include is so great and so, it's so charitable at the same time. It's so expansive, it's impossible, it's unrealistic, and it's definitely very human. Here you have this piece called Bone Flower. It was made in 2010-11. It was made for the Guimet Museum, which is an Asian museum in Paris originally. And it reflects the same idea of everything being a flower, animals being a flower. The flowering idea is that it has the height of life and reproduction, and then it dies. Winter flower, which this piece is called, is all white with black spiky bison horns. And it creates this creature-like thing that is opened but is devoid of life and remains waiting for the next life. This drawing that I put next is called Golden Opportunity. And it's kind of an expression of faith and hopefulness. And it allowed me to really talk about how my drawings and my sculpture are very related. You can see on the bottom of this drawing the same kind of architecture as the sculpture Winter Flower, but here you have the figure sprouting out of it, and the hair and the arms are feather-like, and part of the body has already separated and floated up to the upper region, and you can see that silvery legs beginning to taper. So all these things really create a dynamic in the work that is both metaphorical and symbolic. I love the color golden, because it talks about all these things that are amber, very much like the amber skin or the amber bottle. It is a brown, is a natural as green. And so here in this figure, sudden disposition, paled her already pliant body, spawned. It is a reference to a sudden explosion of life. And you can see the sun behind her, it also being golden, the green bodies that float past her in this horizontal spray, and the pink planets that begin to send message of the world before her, circling her. And then finally, the very beautiful little earth that we see, all blue, in its habitat being the universe that we don't see, that we know is there. And in some sense, sudden dispossession is this idea of leaving home, but also finding home in leaving home, realizing that home is the pleasure of this conceptual idea that human beings have been able to carry with them, even in physical reality when they leave. So the whole universe being your home is my ambition, that every place in the world is really my home. And if we can manage to reach for this, we would never feel the grief of leaving home. And so this, as an immigrant child, was very much the kind of thing that I would think about. Why is this not my home? Why is this not my home? Why is this not my home? And so this is kind of way that we reach to this kind of place of peace, where we realize there is really no reason why it shouldn't be your home. And so the event of actually being present in a literal way is not necessary anymore. And so I would really ask, are we not all of the diaspora, the human diaspora? And so those are the kinds of things that I really enjoy thinking about. This is an earlier work where you can see that the painting, drawing quality was more delicate, the paper was more visible, and the writing was printed. So the writing that became my titles later on was very much part of the drawing itself at that time in 2005. So I wanted you to see a sampling of that, how it evolved from this to what we have now. And this is a sculpture that came from that period of time. It is also a lot more minimal. And it has this kind of element of the vegetable, the plant, the flower, water in the clarity of the plastic on the very left. And the alligator, these ancient animals really talk about our ancient selves. And so the alligator is a recurring theme, as is the snake, the turtle. And so I gravitate to these mythological creatures. And here it is, this piece is called Burnt Fruit. And of course it has a little larger title that talks about the world. And one of the ways in which I decided I would make work that talks about the whole world, what we call global art, is to really think of the whole world as my home. And Burnt Fruit talks about a kind of dark period where there is the kind of threat that home would be burnt, used up, in danger, in crisis. And so in that piece, I have the pleasure of knowing that in that fruit, there remains still the seed of life to begin again. And so the alligator jumps forward. And you see here the figure jumps out of planets, is in the universe, and weaves through her nail and through her hair new places to go, to travel. And I think traveling is so much part of the human inclination, whether it is going across the street or going to another person's home. This is the pleasure we find that we don't have right now during the pandemic, that doesn't allow us to feel at home. Because home is not the ownership of a place, but it is the ability to travel elsewhere, to define different places by the people we meet in them to create a relationship with the ground we live on. And so if you can imagine my earlier work in 2005, this particular drawing, which is, I think is at the Center Pompidou, when I saw it, I realized that here the figure where her tail is a braid itself and her fingers extend themselves, can reach almost the other figures so far away, that there's so much in the air that you can really focus not on the landscape, but the air itself, that all these things you cannot see exist. Very much like real air, which we know has a content, and that we breathe air, there is also this other places, other lands, other cultures that we breathe in through our culture. If you can imagine, we siphon all of it through our bodies, our leaky bodies. And so I'm always painting with watercolor to define the body as almost translucent, that you begin to poke through the ribs and you begin to see appendages look like frogs or other animals. And it's really to reference our evolution through other animals, even insects, and even flowers, even cells. Here you have the rupee in Dhaka note that's pasted as collage. You have the moon before you, moonshine. And it's really in reference to all these things that I've been talking about, but also to reflect on how light itself is based on how much you have. This is also an earlier piece displayed at the Guimet near textiles, right on its left. And you'll see that I use hair and this idea of waterfall to create gesture in some of my sculpture. Again, the ostrich egg, a mop is there on the bottom next to a ponytail. And so references that are formal also are issue in the work and become a way of producing language that we can all relate to through our bodies and our domesticity. You have a very small drawing here. It is a drawing of a small figure, and you can see the legs look like the root of a vegetable. And you can see the figure is atop of a very cute elephant. I do love elephants, and they have a lot of playfulness, I feel, and a sense of presence. So I gave this elephant a very startling eye, and the elephant is the pleasure of seeing the world, having shared its back for this human figure. And it is about, as it says written on the elephant, commerce captured. To capture something is to have it for yourself forever. And I think one of the pleasures of commerce is never having anything forever, always in transition, always getting ready to leave and to take new things. And so the pleasure of this is our own transformation, that is our reward. Here you have in this larger drawing the tossling of figures and the kind of monstrous kind of face I associate with transformation, but also monstrous faces and bodies reflect our inability to understand its beauty, that we reject its beauty. And I think that is something that I really think about in the mythology or fairy tales I read. And certainly in the first image we saw of Little Red Riding Hood, the monstrous face of the multiple eyes, as well as meeting grandmother. The lack of familiarity with a place makes it feel monstrous or wondrous. Here, this work I feel like is such a large piece. There's so many elements that are really hard to see. It's an upside dome, which refers to madness. The piece is called A World Lost. And so madness is where we arrive at if we lose the world. Below it is the all the continents together as one housing, one piece of land floating on ocean. And the world is being drained out through this funnel, which is a metaphor for madness during the 16th century. And so below this kind of madness is this balance, this kind of steel balance that is archaic, that holds two ostrich eggs with two rivers. And you can see the painted red of the rivers, but also the red threads. There are references to water loss as well, and land loss, eroded, and amazing amount of, which is hard to see on the floor where the red is to your right, are these glasses to reference water, how we are losing water to global warming. And if you could see details, you would see the miniaturization of the world in a playful way to talk about our control over it, our wish to control it. Again, the world is captured in collage in this drawing. And here you can see the yellow figure. Of course, pink and yellow have references to all kinds of things, from natural pigments to food like turmeric, and certainly beets I always reference because they have this enormous amount of generosity of pigment that I really enjoyed as a child, but also enjoyed in the vegetable world, in the root world. Something that doesn't see light at all has so much light, like carrot and beet. And so those things come to my work. I want to talk about here tropicalization. The tropical is very much the pleasure of my work, that it references paradise where everything grows. And it's a kind of hopefulness and wishfulness that everything can grow, that nothing has to be exterminated or given death, that we can pleasure in cohabitation, coexistence. And so the horn, which is the aggression of it, and the bulbous gourd that you see, and the little altar light, which are the Chinese altar lights, become part of this piece. It is a kind of altar to that. There's peacock feathers on your left that are gathered together to form a tassel. And all the work, I would say, is very handmade. It has very little power tools, for example, or manufacturing in it. It is the handmade, made in a hand arrangement in the sculpture that is like this, which is on the wall. And so that pleasure comes out of my interest in the cottage industries, in all the places I've seen in the world where not only women, but villages, as well as communities and families have taken part in the handmade at home. And so that is very evident in the work. Here is a drawing where I really can bring attention to the disappearing and the body kind of becoming diffused into the paper as watercolor, the sense of the tongue being relevant in the work. What can we speak of? Are we allowed to speak? What is spoken? Who is silenced? And then the droplets, the orange droplets, to talk about the acidity of the rain in this particular work, but the acidity of the world itself. You know, its resistance to our movements is very relevant. So we have the next few works that are a number of two-dimensional works, wood panel. Specifically, they're small pieces, and they reference the inside of the body, and I want to bring special attention to how they take into consideration the body leaping, going forward. And in going forward, it kind of dissolves into the landscape, into water. And you can see in her arm, water is being driven out of her body because she is moving so fast. Here, the blue is actually silver leaf, And silver leaf and gold leaf is something I use in these particular works. And they have this reflective quality that allows us to think about contemplation, but also in its coloring requires us to really think of what is blue, the sky and the ocean. That is the sandwich between the brown, which can be the earth, or the amber. And so you can see her legs really becoming something other than human in taking these leaps through vegetation and through flower. And this work is one of the last works that I share with you. This was a very special project made in New Orleans for Prospect 4. And for Prospect, I wanted to create a piece that had to do with multiple heritages, and specifically the African-American heritage and women in particular. And so this work is called Viola, named after Viola Ida Lewis, who lived in New Orleans during the 1800s. And she married what was considered then a Black Bengali. And a Bengali here came from India, Kolkata, arrived at the Harlem River in the 1800s. And there were approximately 300 Bengalis at the time. And they all married and was welcomed by the Southern Black Church in their migration and in their freedom away from slavery. They were new immigrants in the North, and they were not allowed to practice, to have a vocation. And so in this difficulty, they collaborated with Black Bengalis who were also not allowed to practice their vocation, which is the selling of silks. So this is the silk route that was denied by the British at the time. And they escaped India to come to the United States to create a new business of silks in the major cities like New Orleans. And they spread out throughout the United States. And I wanted to bring to this work these oyster shells and these feet that talk about the multiplicity of places they had been, and also to talk about the shores. The oyster is often considered one of the ugliest seashells, and inside it is the most beautiful pearl. And I think that is the promise of all beauty, that beauty belongs with things that we perceive as ugly. Ugly like a particular race, a particular migration. And I wanted to share with you also in this close-up that Viola has a Yoruba mask, and she has Murano tusks, and they are very large and aggressive, and they almost poke the ground itself. She is hunched over in this fervor of labor that is required for her to establish her identity in this place, in this new place of forced migration. And she has these kinds of telescopic sconces, which is early American antiques that I use. It is a found object. What is also an object found from India are these rakes. And you can see they almost look like hands that they kind of bring all the oyster shells together. There is a flutter of wings that are made of fabric, thread, and beads, seeds, and they have Korean wedding dresses as the fabric that I chose to use. And it is this kind of bouquet of different cultures that bring it together, that allow me to talk about not just New Orleans, but also about the world and rescuing the world. Behind her is a flower, which is a parachute in the way I designed the figure in relationship to the dome. And it is this idea that she's landed with parachute and is about to do her labor. So I think that ends our presentation of photos and images of the artwork that I wanted to share with you. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have lots of wonderful questions. I'm going to bring it over to Falguni, who is going to direct you further on.
Thank you, Rina, for that richly illustrated and something of a whirlwind presentation, really. There is a wealth of material that you work with. There's light bulbs, fabric, feathers, and truly a Catholic collection of found objects, which you then transform into your sculptural universe, which is populated by all the mythologies that you associate with. And I want to start at that intersection of material and mythology. And we already have, I can see, quite a few questions from the collectors in our audience who are also curious about what informs your choice of material. And, you know, how does your choice of material translate into, I have a question here from Megha Joshi, from Bhavik Shinde, who are wondering, how does this translate into a practical side of things, you know, as installation, storage? Are you very particular about these things? Certainly, you're not the first artist making fragile works or works that are even evocative of a fragility. But how do you deal with the practicality of that?
So I think one of the important things to recognize, and I guess because I was a material science engineer previously, I'm very familiar with materials. I studied with the idea of plastics and metallurgy, in particular plastics. And so one of the things that I recognize that most of our science has been invested in preserving things, materials that are natural, actually. And so our museums, some of the oldest things we have, plus 1,000 years old, are things like linens and silks that we've managed to understand over long periods of ownership. And so in some ways, especially in references to colonial culture, one of the major things that were being transported in commerce from Asia to what we call the West was textiles. There is such a rich history of textile that we identify with, that was an inheritance from families. My mother gave me saris, for example. So I think it was really important for me to put this in my work so that it may be preserved. I'm interested in textiles all over the world. And, you know, I reference wedding dresses, and I use wedding dresses from all over the world in its ethnicity to be preserved, its culture to be preserved, to be considered a serious history, because this is serious sculpture. And so even those rakes that you see, I think it's amazing that this like very unsophisticated tool is a major event in our evolution. So my attraction to these archaic things like light bulb, even today, we're beginning to lose our light bulbs. They're not gonna look like what we call the ideal light bulb anymore. And so I'm thinking very seriously about the archive, you know, preserving. And so a lot of these things that which you would think looks fragile are actually made of steel. And they're very strong, and they have joints, and they come apart. And the crates are flat, and they come as boxes, and there's manuals, instructions how to put it together. Like any large object, it can't travel this large when it goes into sea. So I think I had portability in mind, because definitely that is the message in the work as well. And also the human handwork that we forget is so beautiful, that I thought in contemporary culture, we're beginning to lose it in the artwork itself. There is such a force of reckoning with adhesives, for example, which are non-archival, that need to be replaced constantly. That isn't true about sewing and wiring. So I use very fundamental, almost primitive ways of making something. And you can only reference craft in that way. But I'm not in any way interested in high craft. I'm interested in the casual craft that we all are familiar with in the home. And so what I have created is an artwork that has minimal intrusion of tools that we identify with and glorify in some ways, like power tools, heavy machinery, a Richard Serra kind of making, or a kind of making that has to be manufactured. I love the pleasure of a team of people coming with me and working on an item. And so it really references this domestic world as well.
I'm interested. I mean, it's nice that you said that you want to eschew a Richard Serra kind of making, because it could be perceived as a political statement, even to say that your realm is, I mean, your imagery is truly cosmopolitan, but it's coming out of a studio space, which you say is decidedly domestic, and that's a powerful statement, I think. And going from one powerful statement to another, I have a question here from Tasneem Mehta, who's asking, why have you used red for the Taj? Is it a political statement? And because we're on the question of the Taj, I think we can take one more from Priyasri Patodia, who says, in extension to the Tasneem question, I want to add, did you use red to the Taj because the craftsmen who sacrificed their lives in the making of this monument?
Well, I have to say, I am very aware of labor. The artist in some way labors and labors over work, but I have particularly chosen a path of detail labor that is both visible but is small. And so I have a certain love for the kind of labor it took to make the Taj so beautiful. It is not only because it's white and marble and luminous in its beauty, but it's the pleasure in the tiny work that allows it to be memorable in my mind because of the human labor involved, and that the eye never forgets those details of the Taj. And I think the other thing that was really important in remaking the Taj for the rest of the world, which is to not make it exactly like the Taj. It is not a replica. It is an object that references the Taj, but has escaped it, moved away from it. And so the hot pink, which it is made of plastic. And because I was a plastic engineer, I had a relationship with Alcoa. And we asked the company to lend us this particular type of plastic, which is used in the home to cover food. And sometimes it's called plastic wrap, but sometimes it's called saran wrap. And it allowed color to come through in the plastic. And I wanted to use pink because I think pink is about this idea of tenderness. It's also the inside of our body. If we forget our skin color and how we look, if we undress ourselves of our skin itself, we would look pink. And so I'm always very fond of this idea that we enjoy our humanness, but we forget our humanness because of our skin. So literally the Pink Taj is made of this plastic skin. And the way I made it by hand is to rub several pieces of the plastic, pressing it. And the plastic has this ability called memory of plastic. The memory of plastic allows it to not only take the print of your hand, but to wrinkle it in rubbing it and fix it with the heat of your hand that it responds to. And so it became a very popular thing for people in the home to easily stretch the skin over food and adhere it with the body heat. And I said, this is a great idea. My daughter was at the time 6 months, Ananya, and she would love to play with it. And perhaps one of the things that I really took joy in is I pleasured in pink more because I had a daughter. And it was the joy of having a daughter at that time as well when I made it in 1999, which was displayed all over the world and continues to have venues past the retrospective to other museums. So it's one only large sculpture that I've kept. It's made of copper wire, it's framed. So I also think in finding home and having immigrant or diaspora identity, it pleasures in the tent, this formidable like house of beauty that doesn't allow you to rest because it's not solid. And so there's a liquid quality to it.
Yeah. And I love that little anecdote about your daughter in pink, because we actually have a question from Bhavik Shinde here, who has asked, what is the personal intention that you have towards using a primary and monotone color scheme? I don't know if you agree with him.
Well, it's really impossible to make primaries with watercolor. It is acrylics and it's inks, and both acrylic and ink have their unique quality that doesn't allow it to have this kind of solid primary look. The pigments I use are pure pigments, so often I do use it as pure pigment, but there's a lot of mixing going on. And one of the secret techniques Rina likes to use is to age the paint. And when you age paint in water media or alcohol media, it changes the pigment itself. And so you see this kind of disruption of that watery watercolor stain that you get on paper, because you have these little micelles forming, which are particles in the plastic of the acrylic paint that creates a kind of dispersion of particles, and it looks almost like mold growing. And I love that kind of reference to the surface, which I see naturally in everyday life. So if you could be there with the work physically, you would see a lot of richness in the color that doesn't make it opaque.
Yeah. Certainly, it's very seductive, your works visually, I know, but as a writer, what appeals to me also is the titles. And we have a question here from Arshia Lokanwala, who says, Rina, could you comment on your titles? They are so enigmatic and complicated. I think they are works of their own. Could you elaborate?
I would love to. So the titles came out of my desire first to communicate what the work was about without being didactic, and also to leave in the text, in the title, the pleasure of the unknown. I think complexity in the work and complexity in the title were both things I wanted to happen in parallel universes. And I think that people feel comfortable with text, even when they don't understand it, at least they can read the text. And I thought that people, especially early in my career trajectory, they were like, what is this about? Why is she using these materials? Or it was too dense or too obscure. And I think inventing new language means having a little bit of gray. And with that, I also wanted to put ingredients about broken English, which was part of my mother's experience. And when I came to the US, I had a little bit of English accent from growing up and learning English in England. And I loved my mother's Indian accent in her English. And all those things together with growing up in Queens and hearing the accent of the Chinese, the Korean, the Caribbean people, the Spanish people, when they were speaking English, made me want to disrupt good grammar for the sake of the people. And English has been spoken in so many ways. It is in itself a flower that to be reckoned with. It is an excessive flower.
I think there are so many, I see in our chat box here, comparisons. People have compared your work to Meera Nair's, who also addresses diaspora. And Sarita Chauhan here has said that your choice of materials is actually very shamanic in terms of feathers, horn, hair. Can you talk a bit about this for her?
Well, you know, being in an urban area, there's a couple of references to animal that I experienced. One, The only animal I really see are insects and birds. And so they're in my work because that is my environment. And so the environment becomes a conduit in which to talk about what it symbolizes, what it can mean, what I can invest in that. And so I'm creating ideas through that medium. But I'm also interested in what happens in the urban, in the location I'm in. I was used to going to the museum, and the museums didn't, in my growing up, have very much in terms of textiles. And I really did love African oceanic art, which had feathers and cowrie shells, and learning about currency. And one of the things that I do with currency is think about the value of people as currency. So we have a currency that is associated with gender, with race, with your height, with your age. And all these create not only powers or the lack of power, but visibility. And I think that when we think of currency, we automatically think of maybe ancient currency, or perhaps, you know, contemporary digital currency or credit cards and things like that. But I think the currency that is most pivotal in deciding whether we become one home is the currency we associate with people. And so I really find that is a very important thing and ingredient in my work.
I want to end this conversation here at the note which you've left this answer with, the currency of people. And I want to go back to the figure of the green alien, which recurs in so many of your drawings, and the association you make with the green cards and the pink cards, and how all of that is so pertinent in our discourse today about citizenship and nationhood, which is really taking newer forms from when you made these works. And, you know, there are really a lot of questions, but I'll try to take one more and club it in this. Arsha Lokanwala has asked, could you speak a bit about the feminist aspect you draw on in your work? And, you know, I want to take these ideas of your rich roots of feminist scholarship and the time that you spent at Yale, which you have said has been so formative in your thinking as a maker. Do you think about these tags of Indian-born woman artist, or do you find a way to eschew these tags? And when people put you, as the art world often does, in these boxes, how do you manage to push past these?
Well, I think your question about the box for artists is a very relevant one for all people, all makers, because how you are identified with does result in, as we talked about, currency. And so I think artists get involved with wanting to control that because they don't want their work to be devalued because of the way they look. That would be really shallow. And that's the life we lead. And in some sense, ironically, the visible is not shallow. And I think that as a woman artist, women have struggled with whether they should be termed woman artists, as brown artists, as artists who are older artists who were often left out of important shows because they were too old, or they thought that it wasn't relevant to what is current news. And so we're also ageist, for example. I think, Valuni, we were talking about, and Solani was also talking about Anish Kapoor and how he didn't want to be an Indian artist, and that really touched my thoughts about that. And I think it's a very difficult question to put to an artist because we're not asking white artists, how do they feel about not being called a white artist? We're not asking men, how do they feel about not being called a male artist? And so it's clear we're not in addressing this identity, whether Anish Kapoor is being addressed as an Indian artist. I could see his resistance because they're not asking other artists in England if, why aren't they called, you know, white artists? And so, or English artists. So I think there is a very good thing that came out of this disharmony or disagreement, which is to realize that's really not talking about the art enough. That's a starting point of talking about the work. And in essence, for women's lives to become integrated in the world that is captured by men, like my alligator, which has captured the globe. In order to participate, we have to be considered human artists. But at the same time, there is a specific world that we're trapped in, which is the women's experience that we need to communicate, because that experience has wealth, and wealth that needs to be shared, because we've had to be forced into understanding in these dark reaches of the world where we reside, whether it's the home or being ignored as artists, that we have to think about many things deeply, that we didn't have the privilege of being a man. And so, wow, what an experience it is to be a woman has to be celebrated, I think. So I enjoy exhibitions around women artists, around, even if we had an exhibition that created around many different age groups instead of one age group. I think those things are really important to diversify who we bring into the conversation and about what. And certainly those subjects that were in the dark is very important to us now in the future, because they allow us to handle, survive, and become agile to crisis that is happening right now. They're the ones who have had the deep thoughts to create a solution for our future. It is not going to be, as human beings are, the people who are comfortable, who are privileged. So the problem solvers are in those dark reaches. And that's why it's important for me to identify myself as a woman, because I've had experiences you would not believe. And so I think the pleasure of that celebration has to be intact as well.
Thank you, Rina. And on that note of subjects which are in the dark reaches, which we hope your works and the works of our upcoming speakers and artists will help us unravel, I will ask Saloni to come in to give her closing remarks.
Rina, thank you so much for answering that question on identity, gender, and what it means to be a woman artist in today's world, particularly of, a diasporic woman, female artist. And I'm sure this has offered our viewers an insight into how a practice is also sustained over years, those fabulous works that you showed us, and how privileged these people would be, who museums, collectors, who have this piece of history of yours with them, as it has certainly evolved with a lot of rich scholarship and thinking that you have put into it. I wholeheartedly want to thank you on behalf of everyone at Space 118, at all the viewers who are watching and those who will be watching this later. It's been a pleasure to hear you today, all the way from America, early in the morning. Thank you, Rina. And I hope our viewers will tune in next week for a curator talk by yet another multifaceted maker, Diana Campbell Betancourt, who used to be in Bombay before this and now lives in between Dhaka and Belgium and many other parts of the world. She's the founding director, artistic director of the Samdani Art Foundation in Dhaka, and she will take us through 4 editions of the Dhaka Art Summit, which she has single-handedly spearheaded and put on the global art map. We will be sending out invites for this next week, but do follow us on space118.com and our social media handles, which is on Facebook and Instagram, and look forward to having you with us next Sunday at 5 p.m., not 6 p.m. So thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your questions. It was a real pleasure to work with Sulani and Falguni at Space 118.
Thank you, Rina.
Thank you, Rina.